The late summer air pressed down heavy with warmth, the kind that makes the sidewalks glow faintly even after sundown, the kind that softens edges and slows people's footsteps. Evan walked without purpose, his backpack half unzipped, the earbuds in his pocket rather than in his ears, because for once he wanted the sounds of the city itself, streetlights buzzing faintly, a car radio spilling laughter through an open window, the chatter of strangers that rose and fell without need for his understanding. He was 22 and restless, a student who had grown tired of classes that promised much and delivered little, a young man who had slipped into the uneasy territory between boyhood impatience and the first real taste of independence. He had been waiting, though he could not say for what, until that evening when his waiting was interrupted by her voice, not spoken to him but thrown into the space ahead of him like a stone into still water. She was arguing with a clerk outside a small corner store, not angrily, not even harshly, but with that dry tone of a woman who had stopped pretending to play nice years ago. Something about the price of wine, or perhaps the principle of it, Evan could not catch every word, yet he was riveted not by the argument itself but by the way her face moved when she spoke. Her features were not polished smooth the way girls his age seemed to be, their skin unlined, their smiles rehearsed for photographs. Instead her mouth curved sharply, her brow lifted with force, her hair, dark at the roots, coppered at the edges, refused to obey any perfect symmetry. She seemed utterly uninterested in how she appeared, which made him unable to look away. When she finally broke off from the clerk, tucking the bottle under her arm with a muttered word of satisfaction, she caught sight of Evan. Their eyes met just for an instant, and he knew she recognized the fact that he had been watching, not like a passerby stealing a glance but like someone who had just stumbled upon a secret and refused to give it back. Instead of turning away embarrassed, he stepped forward and offered, with a crooked smile that surprised him as much as her, "I think you won that one. He's going to be telling stories about you for a week." The woman blinked, and for a second her mouth resisted, almost determined not to bend into anything as trivial as amusement, but then it happened, her lips lifted, not gracefully, not smoothly, but suddenly, like the cracking open of shutters that had been nailed shut too long. The smile startled her, he could see that, and it startled him too, because it felt like he had done something far larger than make a stranger laugh. They ended up walking the same direction, and the conversation, at first brief, at first hesitant, began to stretch. He learned her name was Marissa, that she had lived in this part of town for nearly a decade, that she had grown into a kind of anonymity where neighbors nodded without knowing her well. She learned his name only after he told her twice, because the first time she was too busy studying the way his voice carried more eagerness than polish. They joked about the clerk's stubbornness, then about the absurdity of the neighborhood itself, the strange combination of college students and long-timers, of families and solitary people who lived like ghosts. There was nothing romantic in the air yet, not for her, perhaps not even for him, but there was something sharp, something alive, something that pushed against the dullness of their separate routines. When they reached the corner where their paths would diverge, Evan hesitated, and she noticed. He tried not to sound like he was pressing when he said, "If you ever want someone to argue prices with you again, I'm around." Marissa's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in consideration, as if weighing whether to dismiss him or let the moment exist. She nodded once, curtly, but the curve of that reluctant smile still lingered as she turned away. He walked home lighter than he had expected, replaying the image of that unguarded expression, the way her face had seemed both weathered and suddenly bright. He had not known until then that a smile could feel like a victory, not for himself alone but for the very fact that it had appeared at all. And as Marissa climbed the stairs to her quiet apartment, the unopened bottle still in her hand, she paused before the door. She was 42 and had not smiled like that in years, not since before the years of bitterness and distance, before the betrayals and the silences, before she had accepted that certain feelings had aged out of her reach. Yet tonight, for reasons she refused to name, something unexpected had reached back and touched her. Evan saw her again 3 days later, not by chance this time but by design, because he had returned to the same corner store with no real reason beyond the thought that she might appear again, which she did, though not with the same energy. She seemed tired, holding a small bag against her side, dressed in clothes that looked too formal for errands but too casual for work. When she noticed him, her mouth didn't smile but it did soften, which was more than enough. He asked her if she had time for a coffee and she tilted her head as though she had already made the decision before he spoke. They sat across from each other in the back of a cafe where nobody paid attention to anything outside of their phones or their own problems, which gave them space to speak freely but also made the closeness between them feel almost too visible. Evan noticed she didn't ask him questions the way other people did, she didn't pretend to be curious just to pass the time, she waited for things that actually mattered. When he told her about his disinterest in the path he was supposed to be on, about how he didn't know if law school was his choice or his parents', she didn't offer him encouragement or false wisdom. She listened, and then she said, "You don't sound lost. You sound bored." That hit him harder than he expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. He didn't ask much about her life that day, not yet, because he sensed something in her tone that suggested walls weren't meant to be kicked down, but rather waited on. Still, she offered up one detail without prompting. She had been divorced for nearly 8 years, no children, no dramatic ending, just a slow erosion that neither of them stopped. He didn't ask about the man. She didn't say his name. That became the shape of their early rhythm, not secrets exactly, but deliberate silences filled with understanding. What started as coincidence became intention. They met once, then again, then once more, never with a fixed plan but always knowing the possibility was there. He began to time his walks through that part of the neighborhood. She stopped pretending she didn't know when he might appear. Soon they shared more than just jokes and passing comments. He learned that she liked late dinners and couldn't stand early mornings, that she had once studied architecture before switching to something more stable, and that she sometimes still drew buildings in the margins of old notebooks without showing anyone. She learned he couldn't stand being told what kind of man he should become, that he often felt like he was faking confidence in rooms filled with people twice as insecure, and that he hated being called gifted because it meant he owed someone something. These weren't confessions. These were facts, handed over piece by piece, not to be judged or resolved, only accepted. The tension didn't arrive with shouting or drama. It arrived like a small crack widening slowly. It began the moment he was recognized by a girl from one of his lectures while sitting with Marissa in a small restaurant outside the edge of campus. The girl didn't approach, but she saw them, and Evan saw her see them, and the glance she gave wasn't disgust or shock, it was worse, it was curiosity sharpened into speculation. Marissa didn't notice at first, or pretended not to, and he didn't bring it up until they were already walking back in the dark, their shoulders close but not touching. He said, quietly, "Someone I know saw us." She replied, "I figured," and didn't explain further. That night she didn't invite him upstairs. That was the first time he felt the shape of a line he wasn't supposed to cross. What made it more difficult wasn't the age difference, though that was always present in the back of his mind, the way her stories stretched longer, her references older, the way her silences held more meaning than most people's words. What made it complicated was how easily she fit into places he wasn't allowed to bring her. She didn't belong at his friend's apartment, where beer was cheap and jokes were loud and careless. She didn't belong in the student center, where everyone seemed caught in a loop of youth that she had long since stepped out of. He wanted to include her, but not at the cost of making her small to fit. That thought made him quieter. That silence made her suspicious. Then came the call. It was late, just past midnight, and he was in his apartment trying to finish a paper he didn't care about when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. On the other end was a voice that didn't waste time with greetings. "You think people don't talk?" the voice said, low, male, not angry but something colder, condescending, confident. "People notice things. She's not a professor, is she? Just a woman with free time? You don't know what this looks like. You don't know what it'll do to her." The call ended before Evan could answer. He stared at the phone for a long time, his fingers tight around the edges. There was no name, no context, just the weight of the words themselves. He didn't tell her that night. He didn't know how to bring it up without making it worse. But the message was clear: someone had noticed, someone was watching, and someone thought their closeness was a threat. The first time Evan spent the night at her apartment, nothing happened. No sex, no promises, no performance of intimacy, just silence filled with breathing and warmth and the sound of cars passing below the window. She had poured them each a glass of wine without asking if he wanted one, and he had taken it without speaking, their eyes meeting briefly as they sat at opposite ends of the couch, the television playing something neither of them cared to follow. After the wine was gone and the conversation had slowed, she stood up, walked down the hall, and left the door to her room half open. He followed a minute later without thinking about it. The bed was large enough that he didn't need to touch her. Still, her hand brushed his wrist once before she turned over. In the morning, he woke first and didn't know what to do with the fact that he could see her like this, face relaxed, hair undone, body still. He got up, made coffee too strong, and when she joined him in the kitchen, she took the cup from his hand and drank it without asking if it was meant for her. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. From that morning on, their routine changed. He no longer waited for coincidence to bring them together. He called. She answered. Sometimes she called first. Sometimes she didn't. When she didn't, he felt it like something unfinished. Their conversations at night stretched longer. She would tell him about her job, which bored her most days but paid well enough to allow her to live without needing anyone. She talked about colleagues who mistook her quiet for weakness, about clients who wanted things without knowing why. He told her about lectures that blurred into each other, about professors who repeated stories as if they were delivering wisdom, about the distance he felt even when surrounded by people. They rarely spoke about the obvious difference between them. Neither of them wanted to reduce what was happening to numbers. Sometimes he asked about her past, but only in fragments. He didn't want to shape her into a version of a woman who had already been shaped by other men. She spoke of her 20s with detachment, of her 30s with frustration, and of the present with a strange calm that made him more curious. She never used the word lonely, but he could hear it in the way she described her weekends before him, in how she mentioned dinners eaten with the television on, not as complaint but as fact. He noticed how she moved through the world without apology. She didn't adjust her opinions to make others more comfortable. She didn't ask for permission before laughing too loud or saying something sharp. He realized that what made her different wasn't her age, it was that she had stopped waiting to be liked. Being near her made him aware of how often he still performed. With her, he could speak without pretending to have everything figured out. It was after one of those nights, when the hours had passed without either of them checking the time, that the danger became real. They were sitting outside a small bar that she liked because it didn't try to impress anyone. The tables were uneven, the chairs scraped, and the music too low to notice. She had taken off her shoes and was resting her feet against his calf under the table. They were laughing, quietly, in a way that came naturally now, when a figure passed by on the sidewalk and paused. Neither of them saw the face. Neither of them got a name. But there was a moment, a hesitation, a shift in pace, the slight tilt of a head in their direction, that told them they had been seen. Evan felt it immediately. He turned his head, but the figure was already walking again, quickly, as if to erase the moment by leaving it behind. Marissa hadn't moved. She kept her glass in her hand, her gaze on him. He said nothing, and she didn't ask. But the silence that followed was not their usual kind. It was heavier, full of knowledge that could no longer be ignored. The next day, he heard it. Not from a friend, but in the hallway outside one of his seminars, whispered too loudly by a group of students who assumed he wasn't nearby. They were laughing. One of them said her name wrong. Another guessed her profession. Someone else asked if he thought she paid for his drinks. None of them said anything cruel, not exactly, but every word was built on assumption, and every assumption came with a smirk. He didn't confront them. He stood behind the wall, jaw tight, and waited until they walked away. That evening, he didn't go to her place. He turned his phone off, not because he didn't want to speak to her, but because he didn't know how to protect her from what was coming. When he finally did call, it was after midnight. She answered immediately. "I think someone saw us the other night," he said. "I know," she said. "I think people are going to start talking." "They already are." He waited, expecting her to tell him it would be fine or to ask him if it was too much. She did neither. "I don't want this to become something you have to defend," he said. "I'm not asking you to defend it," she replied. "But I'm not going to pretend I don't want it." He sat on the floor of his apartment, phone pressed against his ear, the only light in the room coming from the street lamp outside. He didn't know how to answer her. "Evan," she said, not gently, but clearly, "are you ashamed of me?" "No," he said, louder than he meant to. "Never." "Then don't act like it." Marissa had always told herself she could handle distance. She believed that silence didn't hurt if it was predictable. She had built her life on routines that required no one else to complete them. But as days passed with fewer messages and even fewer visits, she began to understand how quickly independence could turn into isolation when someone suddenly mattered. She didn't call him. She didn't beg for attention. She told herself that if he wanted to fade out, he could. She wouldn't chase a man 10 years younger who was still figuring out if he wanted to be seen with her in daylight. But when he showed up unannounced at her door one Friday evening, she opened it without hesitation, not because she had forgiven him but because she hadn't stopped hoping he would come. He didn't speak at first. He walked past her into the apartment and stood in the middle of the living room like he had forgotten what it felt like to be welcome there. She waited. "I told my sister about you," he said, his voice low, words uneven. "Not everything. But enough." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "What did she say?" "She asked me what I was doing. Said I was playing with something I didn't understand. Said you probably didn't care about me. That this was just entertainment." Marissa didn't flinch. She nodded slowly, then pushed herself off the frame and moved to the kitchen, not to retreat but to give herself a task so she didn't explode from the pressure building in her chest. She poured water into a glass and set it down without drinking. "Do you believe her?" He walked toward her, not too close. "I told her I wasn't playing. That I knew exactly what I was doing." "And do you?" "Yes." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed on the glass. When she finally looked at him, there was no anger in her expression, only exhaustion. "Then don't disappear again. If you need time, say that. If you're scared, say that. But don't go silent and expect me to wait like that's something I signed up for." He nodded, stepped forward, and reached for her hand. She let him take it. The next 2 weeks returned to a rhythm, but it was different now, heavier in the way people become when they know they're being watched. At restaurants, she chose the tables with backs to the walls. On campus, he avoided familiar faces when they met. They spoke more carefully, choosing words that couldn't be misinterpreted if overheard. Still, it felt real again, even with the wait. They slept next to each other often, not always in the same apartment, but always knowing the other person was reachable. They stopped pretending it was casual. Then the wedding invitation arrived. It belonged to his cousin, a woman Evan barely saw, but the family had expectations. His parents would be there, along with most of the people who had watched him grow up. He almost threw the envelope away before opening it, but curiosity made him read the names, the date, the location. A hotel ballroom uptown, formal attire, 6 o'clock. He stared at the card for 20 minutes before calling her. "I want you to come," he said. "To what?" "A wedding. My cousin's. It's mostly family." There was a pause. Then, "Are you sure?" "No." "But you're asking anyway." "Yes." That night she stood in front of her bedroom mirror in a dark dress that showed her back and nothing else. She tied her hair up, not because it looked better that way but because it kept her from looking too soft. When he arrived to pick her up, he stared at her for a full minute before saying anything. "You look incredible." She didn't smile. "That's not why I'm coming." "I know." The ballroom was full of noise, people who hadn't seen each other in years cramming small talk into minutes, glasses clinking, laughter that came in bursts. They walked in together, and for a moment no one noticed. But then someone did. A glance, then another, then a hand pressed to someone else's shoulder. It didn't take long. Evan's mother crossed the room faster than expected, a polite expression stretched thin over disapproval. She stopped in front of them and gave Marissa a look that wasn't subtle. "You must be a colleague," she said, her voice smooth, too practiced. Marissa held her gaze. "No. I'm not." There was silence. Evan's hand tightened around hers. He opened his mouth, but Marissa spoke first. "I'm with your son." The room didn't go quiet, but the part they stood in did. Evan's mother blinked, the way someone does when they need time to decide whether to cause a scene. Then she gave a sharp nod, looked at Evan, and said, "You always did like making things difficult," before turning and walking away. Marissa didn't move. Evan turned to her, voice shaking. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she said. "Are you sure?" "No." They stayed another hour. People watched them more than they spoke to them. Some avoided them entirely. One of Evan's cousins tried to make a joke, something about robbing cradles, but stopped halfway through when Evan didn't laugh. When they left, they didn't speak until they were in the car. "I wasn't trying to make a point," he said. "I know. I just wanted you there." "I know that too." When they got back to her apartment, she poured herself a drink and sat on the couch without removing her heels. He sat beside her, still in his suit, staring at the floor. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends," she said, voice calm, words deliberate. "On whether you want this to last, or just to be remembered." Neither of them spoke for days. The silence didn't arrive all at once, it spread slowly, starting with shorter replies, less frequent check-ins, missed calls that went unreturned until the next morning. Evan buried himself in work, not because he cared but because it gave him a reason not to think. He read the same pages twice, wrote paragraphs he deleted immediately, and told himself he was tired, not unraveling. Marissa didn't ask where he had gone, not even when he finally showed up again, this time standing outside her building, hands deep in his pockets, eyes on the ground. She let him in without questions. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, neither touching their drinks, both waiting for the other to name what had already changed. "I don't know how to do this without hurting you," he said. She leaned back in her chair, her face unreadable. "Then maybe the hurt is already here." "I'm not ashamed of you," he said. "I need you to believe that." "I believed it," she said. "I'm not sure I do now. I never meant to let everything around us decide how I see you. But it did." He looked away, then back, his voice rising. "People treat me like I'm some kid being manipulated. They talk like I'm too stupid to know what I want." "And what do you want?" she asked. "You." "I want you." "Then why are you here looking like you're about to say goodbye?" He didn't answer right away. He reached for the glass in front of him but didn't drink. She watched his hand shake. She had seen him nervous before, but never like this, never uncertain, never afraid of his own voice. "I don't think I can keep asking you to carry the weight of how the world sees this," he said. "Every room we walk into, every person who stares, every assumption, it's like I drag it behind us and expect you to hold your head up for both of us." Marissa didn't speak. She stood, crossed to the window, and stood with her back to him. When she finally turned around, her face was blank. "I've carried worse." "I know," he said. "But that doesn't mean I want to carry you through this if you're already halfway out. I'm not leaving because I stopped feeling something." "Then why?" "Because I'm not ready to live inside a version of myself that can't breathe unless you're hiding." The words hit harder than he expected. Saying them made it worse. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest now, not from cold but from the need to hold herself up. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She nodded. "Then maybe this doesn't need to break. Maybe it just needs to end before it becomes something neither of us respects." He stood, slowly, like leaving the chair was harder than walking away. He stepped closer to her, but not too close. His hands stayed by his sides. "I meant everything I said. I believe you. I don't regret any of it." "I don't either." He looked around the apartment once more, not searching for something to take, just memorizing it, her shoes by the door, the cracked ceramic bowl on the table, the book she never finished beside the lamp. Then he left. Weeks passed. Neither of them reached out. The space between them didn't close, but it stopped widening. He kept expecting something, an article, a rumor, a message from someone who had seen them and wanted to stir it up, but nothing came. The noise had moved on. That made it worse somehow. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was just empty. One night, near the end of the semester, he found himself walking through her neighborhood without thinking. He passed the store where he first saw her, the restaurant where they had been noticed, the cafe with the shaky chairs. Everything looked the same, but the air was different now. He didn't knock on her door. He kept walking. Across town, Marissa sat at a dinner with colleagues she didn't like, pretending to care about stories she'd already heard. One of them asked if she was seeing anyone. She didn't lie. She said no. Nobody pushed. They didn't care enough to make it awkward. Later that night, in bed alone, she reached for her phone, stared at it, then placed it face down on the nightstand. She didn't sleep immediately. A month later, they crossed paths again, not by accident but not quite by design either. She was giving a talk at a community event hosted on his campus. He didn't know until he saw her name on the poster. He almost didn't go. Then he showed up late and sat in the back. She spoke clearly, confidently, dressed in black, every word measured but not rehearsed. She looked like someone who didn't need the room to agree with her. She saw him in the crowd once, briefly, but kept speaking. After the event, he didn't approach. He stood outside the building as people filtered out, unsure whether to wait or disappear. She stepped out 10 minutes later, alone. She saw him and stopped. "You stayed until the end," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. "But you did." "Yes." They stood in silence. No cars passed. No voices broke through. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say," he said. "You don't have to say anything." "Do you miss me?" "Sometimes." "Do you hate me?" "No." He nodded. She stepped closer, not enough to touch him, but close enough to be real. "Do you ever think we could have done it differently?" he asked. "All the time," she said. The wind picked up. Someone nearby laughed. A door closed. Life continued around them. He looked at her, waiting for something final. She didn't give it to him. Instead, she asked, "Are you still afraid?" He said nothing. And then she walked past him, not fast, not slow, just forward. He watched her go, standing still, not knowing if this was the end or just another pause. Behind him, the door clicked shut.